We Don't Go Into the Trees of Graves Stand by DarkNightTales. I reached out with a rag and pulled the cast iron skillet from the smoldering embers at the edge of the campfire. The scents of the smoked sausages mixed with those of the onions and peppers, and my stomach growled loudly in anticipation of dinner after a long day riding fences. Almost done, I thought, turning the sausages with a fork and returning the skillet to the glowing coals. It was my first time out on the Double K Ranch, riding along with a couple of the older hands along the border of the 50,000-acre cattle ranch at the edge of the Piney Woods region of Texas. I'd worked other ranches before, mostly in Central Florida, but the prior year I'd felt it was time for a change of scenery, so I picked up and headed west a bit. Found the weather a bit nicer and the scenery a bit more varied, so I liked it well enough. It was an hour past sundown, and we'd just finished setting camp for the night. Nearby, I could hear the quiet shuffling of the horses as they grazed a bit at the ends of their tethers. Above, a billion stars lit the moonless and cloudless sky, and I could see the wispy streaks of the Milky Way stretch out across that dark blanket. The air had grown chilly with the departure of the sun, but it felt good after a hot day in the saddle. "You did good today, kid," said Tommy, the eldest of us three. He looked to be about 100 years old in the flickering light of the campfire, though he was probably no more than 60. I guess a lifetime spent working in the Texas sun would do that to a man. His skin was weathered and dark, and his eyes looked like they were perpetually squinting against the glare, even when there was none. He smiled a lot, though, so it helped to soften the hard edges a bit. Hard to find a good worker these days south of 40. I ducked my head in thanks. "Appreciate it, Tommy." I looked over at Jonas, who had just finished tending to the horses and now took his seat at the fire with us, leaning back into the collapsible nylon chair with a grunt. He accepted a tin cup of what I knew was whiskey from Tommy with an appreciative nod. Jonas was tall and thin, with a bushy gray mustache and close-trimmed hair beneath his age-worn cowboy hat, and no matter how much time I spent around the man, I couldn't get past the fact that he'd looked like he'd just stepped right out of an old Western movie. He even wore a revolver on his hip, preferring the wheel gun to the more modern automatics that the rest of us tended to favor. "Yep, good work, David." He nodded towards me and raised his cup a little. "We're making good time. Figure we'll be just about ready to wrap this job up day after tomorrow and get you home to that pretty little woman of yours," he said with an amiable grin. We'd been out riding fences for what seemed like months, though in truth it was only a couple of days. There was another crew working the south line, but we were responsible for the more rocky and uneven northern border of the ranch. I envied the other crew. They were out in open land, mostly flat and even, which meant they were able to use jeeps to work their sections. That also meant they were able to get back home each night and sleep in their own beds. The northern boundary ran through the hills and piney woods, however, much of it inaccessible to anything not on 2 or 4 legs. So we rode the horses, just like our predecessors did 100 years ago, on this very land. I didn't mind so much. It was peaceful, quiet. A man could think out here. Still, I was only 6 months wed and still in that phase where it hurt my heart to be away from Sophie for any period of time. Maybe next time I'd get put on the southern team. Maybe not. "So," I began, stirring at the peppers and onions to make sure they weren't sticking to the skillet. "There's something I don't understand. Why'd we avoid that section of fence line today? The one that ran back into the woods. Reckon it wouldn't have taken much time to follow it." It was brief, but I didn't miss the look that Tommy flashed at Jonas. Jonas took a sip from his cup and leaned forward slightly, nodding almost imperceptibly. "You mean that lowland tree line we bypassed around noon? That's Graves Stand. We don't go in there," he said, his voice low and graveled. "It's swampy and difficult to navigate. Cattle don't go in there anyway." Tommy nodded his agreement, staring into his own cup, eyes distant. I pulled the skillet from the heat and set it aside, letting our dinner cool a bit before serving it up. "Yeah, but shouldn't we have at least checked it out for fence breaks? I'd hate to think of what Colton would say if he found out we skipped a section. I've known foremen like him before, and he doesn't strike me as the sort to take kindly to taking shortcuts." Jonas waved away my concern and fished a cigarette from his breast pocket. lighting it with a smoldering twig he pulled from the fire. "Colton knows we bypass it every time. Hell, he was the one who told us to keep clear of there in the first place." "Ever since that kid, Tommy started, then paused, snapping his fingers trying to recall a memory. "Ricky, from Georgia," Jonas supplied. Tommy nodded. "Right, Ricky. Don't know why I can never remember his name. Ever since Ricky went missing back there in 2005 or 6, it's been off limits." "It was really off limits even before then," Jonas added. He drained his cup and set it down next to his chair. He paused a long moment in silent contemplation. I could tell he was deliberating something of fair gravity. Finally, he nodded almost to himself and said, "I'm going to tell you a story, David, so you don't end up getting curious and wandering where you shouldn't, like Ricky did. First time I ever saw it, I was about your age, maybe a hair older. Been working this ranch as a hand for most of my life, even back then. I'd never been out riding fences for that day, though. Spent most of my time tending to the herd and helping to maintain the equipment. One day, the old boss, Trent Jackson, came to me and told me I'd be joining the next group to ride the North Line, since the old man, that was Nick Terry, had taken ill and wasn't expected to get back in the saddle anytime soon. Well, as you can imagine, I was fairly excited about the opportunity to do something different, step up a rung and take on some more responsibility around here." Jonas picked the cup up and held it out to Tommy, who splashed a little bit more into it. "It was the third day of the ride when we came across that section of fence line, one where it just disappears into the dark pines. The two guys I was with at the time were both pretty new, and I guess nobody had ever told them to keep clear of that land. So when we reached it, we just followed that fence line into the shadow of the trees. It's funny. I remember that it was a hot day, middle of summer as I recall. I was anxious to get out of the sun and into the shade of the pines, but when we broke that tree line, the air wasn't cool and pleasant like you'd expect. It was more like walking into a closed shed in the middle of a hot day. It was humid and still, and I think we all felt a little ill at ease. Hell, the horses didn't even want to go." Tommy smiled. "I always said they was smarter than you," he chided. Jonas chuckled a little at that, nodding his head. "I suppose you're right. Anyway, in we went, following the rusty barbed wire fence, watching for slack or broken wires. Even then, I thought it was a little strange that cattle never wandered back into the trees in that spot. You've seen the ground all around that area. It's turned up something awful from their grazing even today." He looked at me and gave me a tight smile. "We all know that cows ain't the smartest thing out there. How many times have we had to go out into the eastern woods to bring some wanderers back home who couldn't figure out how to get out once they got in? Still, something kept them out of that tree line. Something they could sense. Well, that old fence line runs on for about a mile or so back into those dark woods before looping back out in a gentle curve. Not even sure who the hell thought it was a good idea to set it out there in the first place. Probably one of the original Kirkman clan when they first bought the land, I suppose. Anyway, first thing we all noticed was that the fence in this whole area was in a pretty bad state of neglect, like it hadn't been seen to in decades. Jim Tillman, the head man of our group, made a note of it and figured we'd probably be back out here in a couple of weeks replacing the whole damn thing. We had supplies for repair, not replacement of an entire line, so we just kept on, making sure there weren't any breaks. Jonas paused a second, taking a pull from his cigarette before continuing, his eyes now distant. Bill was the first one to notice them. He always had the sharpest eyes of us. Here and there, scattered among the trees, were these little hanging ornaments of some sort, made up of sticks and string and bits of animal bones, almost like those stupid dream catcher things that you see some folks hang from their rearview mirrors, but different. These looked old, real, if you take my meaning. These weren't some sort of souvenirs you can pick up at those roadside tourist stands. They were ugly, menacing, like they meant business somehow. We didn't quite know what to make of them, but Bill seemed a little uneasy after we started seeing them. He had Wichita blood in him, and I think that part of him was trying to send out some sort of warning. We were committed, though. We'd already spent a couple hours winding through the trees and didn't want the foreman to find out that we'd been spooked and skipped a whole section of the fence line. Figured we'd be out of it and back out into open land soon enough. Besides, we were all armed and weren't about to be scared off by some trinkets left by God knows who. The ground had been mostly marshy and soft, and the horses were starting to have a hard time at it, till it finally started rising back up some and becoming firmer. It was getting late in the afternoon by that time. We decided to find a clearing where we could tie the horses up and set camp for the evening. And that's when Bill spotted the shack. Jonas took another sip and continued, his pale gray eyes glistening in the firelight. At first, we weren't really sure what it was we were looking at. Looked like an old homesteader shack, probably abandoned for generations at that point. It was situated in the middle of a fair-sized clearing in the trees with a bit of a creek running off to the side of it, though, so we figured it was as good a place as any to make camp. Bill went off to gather firewood while Jim and I tied a makeshift corral for the horses and set to clearing away the pine needles and leaves and finding what rocks we could for the fire ring. By now, the sun had dipped low, throwing most of the area into deep shadow, though there was still some light in the sky yet. As Jonas spoke, I started dishing out supper for him and Tommy, almost without thinking. I'd never seen Jonas so caught up in a memory and had never heard him say so many words strung together before. He was normally a quiet man, always watching and listening, but rarely speaking. When he did open his mouth, I'd learned early on that everyone tended to listen to what he had to say. He was that kind of man, if you know the type. We finished getting the areas set up for us to bed down. Back in those days, we mostly just slept on bedrolls under the stars, since that was before they started with all the ultralight compact tents we have these days. Bill still hadn't come back with the firewood, and we figured he was probably having a tough time finding dry wood and kindling among all the damp and rotting ground clutter we'd seen. While we were waiting, Jim said we should probably check out that shack before it got full dark, just to make sure there wasn't anyone inside who was going to cause us trouble in the night. I didn't think it was too likely, but part of our job was to make sure there weren't any trespassers on Mr. Kirkman's property, so I went along. We walked over to it, maybe 20 yards from where we set up for the night. I noticed what looked like a braided rope laying in front of it, and thought that maybe at one time it had been stretched across the door, until time and the weather took its toll and it eventually let loose and fell to the ground. It was strange, though. Not anything like the twisted hemp ropes we used. It was more ornate, I guess is the word. The braid was intricate and it was dotted here and there with patterns made from beads. I remember wondering why anyone would string a rope around this little shack, but didn't give it much more thought, to be honest. Anyways, we get to the door and Jim reaches out to pull it open when I spotted some strange-looking writing and symbols carved into the face of it, spanning the door from one side to the other and even running onto the walls on either side. Neither one of us recognized it. It certainly wasn't English or any other language I had seen for that matter. Jim said it looked like Comanche to him, but I thought he was full of shit. Wouldn't know Comanche if it bit him in the ass. Hell, I wasn't even sure Comanche had a written language. We were starting to lose the light about then, so we both grabbed our flashlights and, without another word, he pulled hard at that door. At first, it didn't budge. Jim was a big old boy and put all his strength into it until finally it gave up and flung open all of a sudden with a crack like a gunshot, like it had been locked or barred on the inside. Jonas paused a moment at that point, setting his untouched plate on the ground beside his chair and taking another sip from his cup. His eyes drifted to the flickering flames of the campfire and held there a while, and I could tell he was wrapped up in his memories. Not taking his gaze from the campfire, he started again. As soon as that door came open, I knew something was off. We both did. You could feel it in the air, like when you can feel when a powerful storm is coming. This was different. Wrong. Felt like we shouldn't have been there. He shifted his eyes up to mine. Felt like we'd just made a mistake. I was starting to wonder if Jonas was having me on. Hazing the new guy and all. I looked from him to Tommy and I could see the old man's eyes were fixed hard on the fire. His thoughts distant and maybe a little unpleasant if the set of his brow was any indication. Jonas looked up at the stars for a moment as he continued. It's strange. I remember that very moment like it was yesterday, like it's branded in my memories. Air got all cold all of a sudden, and the world around us fell silent, still. It's like everything was just holding its breath, waiting to see what was going to happen. The shack was empty, or near enough. In the middle of the dirt floor was a jagged black hole in the ground, probably 3 feet across. Couldn't tell you how deep it was. We stepped up to the edge as carefully as we could and shined our lights down in there, but if there was a bottom to it, it was beyond what we could see. Jim towed a rock over the edge, and we listened to it bounce along the walls as it fell for a long while before we couldn't hear it anymore. Never did hear it hit bottom, though. What we did hear was a different sound, like the scrabbling of something way down there in the dark, maybe climbing up the rough walls of the pit even while we stood there shining our flashlights into it like a beacon, like a couple of dumbasses. We could hear what sounded like claws or nails in the hard dirt and rock of that hole. They sounded frantic, eager, hungry maybe. Hell, I don't know, but it sounded like a lot of them. One thing that was pretty clear at the time was that it sounded like they were getting closer and fast. I don't know what manner of beast can climb a sheer vertical tunnel with that sort of speed. I was pretty certain I didn't want to find out. Stepped back out of the door of the shack, keeping my light trained on the hole, just listening to the sound getting closer and closer. Jim hadn't moved. He stood there at the edge of that black abyss, shining his light down into it like he was transfixed by something he saw, or something he expected to see maybe. I realized that at some point, I'd switched the flashlight to my left hand and rested my right hand on the butt of my pistol like I was expecting to have to use it. The sounds were getting even closer now, even more frenzied in their movements. It sounded like someone scratching away wildly from inside a closet or maybe a coffin. I opened my mouth to call for Jim, to pull him back away from the edge and outside of that shack altogether, when I heard Bill's voice from the campsite behind me, calling out to us and asking us what we were doing. I spared a look over my shoulder to see him walking over towards us, having dropped a pile of firewood near the ring and dusting his hands off on his jeans. He nodded his head towards the shack and asked what we'd found. I was already turning back to grab Jim out of there by the scruff of the neck if I had to. That sense of dread was growing by the second in the back of my head, and I was sure something bad was about to happen. In that instant, as my eyes turned back to it, there was this loud rushing sound, and I had the impression of something big and dark and wet bursting up out of that black hole. I can't tell you what it was or even really what it looked like. I think a man's mind is wired to protect itself from really seeing things that it wasn't meant to, things that might otherwise snap in half like a dry twig. All I remember is that great ebony mass erupting from the pit, all gleaming with a gut-turning stench to it. I seemed to recall legs all around it, like some demon millipede from the bowels of hell itself. I can't tell you if it had a head or a face because the next thing I knew, I was falling backwards hard onto the ground, the wind knocked out of me and my head ringing. I heard Jim cry out something close to a scream of pure horror, maybe pain, but it only lasted a heartbeat before it was silenced. I'd never heard anything that terrible, not in my entire life. From where I lay, dazed and gasping for breath, I could see Bill standing there a few paces away, eyes as wide as they'd go and mouth hanging slack as he looked on whatever abomination had risen up from that pit. His hands hung limply at his side, swaying a bit, and he looked like a puppet being held up by some invisible string. By the time I gathered my senses and scrambled back to my feet, jerking my pistol from its holster, it was over. The thing was gone, along with Jim. The shack was empty once again, except for that damn black hole in the ground. Everything was deathly still. Even the breeze had died and the horses had stopped their whickering. Jonas tossed his cigarette butt into the campfire and drained the last of his drink. Tommy wordlessly reached out and refilled it. This time he offered the bottle over to me as well, and I accepted it with a nod of thanks. Jesus Christ, Jonas, I breathed, my eyes subconsciously drawn to the darkness behind the light of our campfire, at some half-heard sound that was probably just my imagination. This is a joke, right? You're just screwing with the new guy? Tommy and Jonas shared a look that I couldn't decipher, some silent conversation between the two old friends. Jonas removed his hat and ran his hand over his head, smoothing down his short-trimmed hair. He replaced it and leaned forward in his chair, his eyes keen and sharp and fixed on me with a meaningful look. "I wish to hell it was, son." Old Bill was frozen in his tracks, checked out. Nothing I said or did would snap him out of it. I had to manhandle him onto his horse and get us the hell out of there in the dark of night. There was no way I was going to spend another damn minute close to that hole and whatever dwelled down there in the darkness. We got back to the ranch house next day around noon. By that time, Bill's hair had turned almost white, like someone had bleached it. His eyes had clouded over until you couldn't see anything but milky white marbles in those sockets. 28-year-old man. He looked every bit of 100 at that moment. Still hadn't come out of whatever trance he was in, what the doctors called a catatonic state. They said he was alive. It was almost like he wasn't in there anymore, if you take my meaning. Like whatever he'd seen in that instant had broken him beyond repair. But he was still in there. Figured he was hiding in some small dark corner, just praying he wouldn't be found. They committed him to Rockdale, that asylum that used to be up near Gilmer before it was shut down a while back. From that moment, we lost Jim. Bill never said another word, never so much as acknowledged the presence of anyone around him. Only time he'd make a sound was in the dead of night, when he'd sit up straight in his bed at the institution and scream wide-eyed into the darkness until the orderlies came up and sedated him. Jonas set his cup down and turned his eyes back to the fire. One day, about 3 years later, orderlies came into his room for morning check and found him deader than shit, but still sitting bolt upright in his bed, eyes wide and mouth hanging open like it had been that day at the shack. I still wasn't sure how much I believed him, but I didn't get the impression that he was trying to mess with me anymore. Everything about his story felt real, like he was pulling it from memories, not just making it up. "What the hell was it?" I asked. "That thing from the hole?" Jonas shook his head. "No idea. Caddo Indians were some of the earliest tribes to settle this area, but they have stories of an even older race that was here long before them. An old tribe with old ways, one that the Caddo won't even mention by name, like they've been shunned. They whisper stories about human sacrifices and communing with the world below and calling up elder gods to lay waste to their enemies. That sort of stuff. Maybe that's what this was. Some old god they'd summoned up. Hell, maybe it's the reason they're not around anymore. Maybe they reached a little too far, grabbed hold of something beyond their control. Maybe not. All I know is that we don't go into the trees of Gravestand." The Mines Beneath Harper's Hope by DarkNightTales. "So I was talking to some of the other hands back at the ranch," I said, looking across the flickering flames of the campfire to Jonas. The man, looking for all the world like he'd just stepped out of an Old West novel, had been sitting quietly, lost in his thoughts and eyes fixed on the fire, distant. He'd been unconsciously stroking the ends of his salt and pepper mustache and sipping occasionally at a cup of Jameson he held loosely in his other hand. I wouldn't say he was distracted. Those piercing eyes never seemed to lose their keen focus, regardless of where he was or what he was doing. Preoccupied was probably the better word for it. I wasn't surprised. Tommy had recently taken ill with pneumonia and had been laid up in a hospital for the better part of the last 2 weeks. They'd been friends since before I was born, and I knew Tommy's failing health weighed heavily on Jonas's mind. He lifted his eyes from the flames and met mine. The hint of a grin touched at the corner of his mouth. "Oh yeah? What did those clucking hens have to say this time?" I smiled, fished a smoke from my pack, and offered one across to Jonas. He accepted it with a nod, lighting it with an old and battered Zippo from his jacket pocket. "Well, we were just sitting around after work last Friday, shooting the shit over a few beers about what you told me about Gravestand. Apparently I'm the only one around here who didn't know anything about that place," I said with a chuckle. "Well, you're still pretty new around these parts, David. Probably a lot of things you haven't bumped into yet. he said, taking a drag from the cigarette and following it with a quick sip from the tin cup. This place is old and has some shadowy corners if you care to look for them. I ducked my head in a nod. Yeah, I suppose that's true. One of the boys told me to ask you about some old abandoned ghost town around here somewhere up in the hills. He said you had a story about it but wouldn't say anything else. He said it was your story to tell, not theirs. Jonas fell silent for a moment, his eyes drifting back to the yellow light of the campfire, its embers rising between us in the chill autumn night air. I could tell he was mulling it over, probably deciding whether or not to indulge me with another story. He never was one for a lot of talk, a quiet sort who tended to listen more than speak. But we'd been out for a couple days on horseback, making our way through the dense pines of the eastern forests that bordered the Double K Ranch. A few head of cattle had gone missing from the herd, and the boss had put us to finding them. We hadn't found them yet, and I suspected they'd eventually wander back on their own in any case. In the meantime, we'd done our bit and would be heading back in the morning. For now, we'd set camp for the night once we broke out of the tree line and were just enjoying the cool air, warm fire, and the quiet solitude. I figured it'd be a good opportunity to hear more from Jonas about this place. Harper's Hope, he said ponderously, recalling an old memory. Well, I haven't thought about that damn place in a long while. In the distance, the mournful cry of a coyote drifted out of the dark on the light breeze that had picked up with the coming of nightfall. We both glanced over in that direction for a moment before he spoke again. You do know how to pick 'em, David. Aside from Graves' Stand, there's probably nothing around here that unsettles me like that old burned-out place. Bad ground. Bad memories. He lifted his eyes to mine again, and the flickering light from the fire made dark shadows dance across his face ominously. You sure you want to know about that old town? I told you about Graves' Stand for your own safety, seeing as it's something you're like to run near from time to time. Harper's Hope. Well, you'd have to go looking for that place. Not likely to just trip across it accidentally. I nodded eagerly. Well, yeah, if you're willing to tell it. No reason not to, I suppose. It's not like it's a big secret around these parts. Just don't bother asking me where it is. I won't be the one to tell you. I don't need that weighing over me. He settled back a little in his seat. Harper's Hope was settled sometime back in the late 1800s by some families who had come out west from New York. As the story goes, a group of them pooled their savings and purchased the deed to some old gold mine out in the hills. There were more than a few of them, something like a dozen families in all, and only a couple who had any idea how to make any sort of life away from the city. Lots of fools are driven past their limitations by the prospect of wealth, I suppose, even today. I'm not sure why they were so trusting that there would actually be a workable mine on the land they bought when they got there. But fortune is a funny lady. You can never tell exactly what you're going to get when you spin that wheel. For them, they arrived at their claim to find it exactly the way it was promised, including a few remaining structures from an older settlement that they were able to use as the foundation of their own. It turns out, not only was there a mine, but there was still gold running through it. Fair amount, too, from all accounts. The settlers had found their fortune. Within a couple of years, a small town had grown around it. I'm not going to say it was an up-and-coming boom town or anything like that. Still wasn't more than a handful of families and a few businesses that had sprouted up. But to those families that had founded Harper's Hope, sure it seemed that way. Their gamble had paid off big, so they thought at the time. Jonas paused a moment, taking one last drag from his cigarette before flicking the butt into the fire. That mine is an old one, David. I'm not sure anyone knows who dug it in the first place or when. None of the families stopped to wonder why a person would be so keen on selling the deed to a gold mine that was still healthy and producing. That said, in the first few weeks, they depleted the open veins that were readily accessible close to the surface, began searching farther into the old tunnels. When they eventually reached the limits of the existing tunnels, they started digging their own. The farther they dug, the more gold they uncovered. As I understand it, the veins were wide but shallow. The ground seemed to offer up just enough of that shiny metal to keep tempting them deeper into the earth, away from the light of the sun. Maybe deeper than man was ever meant to go. Who knows? For a few years, Harper's Hope thrived. The men continued to push deeper into the dark recesses beneath the hills. Then came the winter of 1899, and with it, the weather turned cold and fierce. The routes in and out of Harper's Hope were cut off for a month or more. When the weather finally righted itself and the storms passed, first traders arrived at the settlement to find an empty husk without a soul to be found. According to what they reported, it looked like someone had just come in and scooped up all the families and left everything else in place. 100 people at least, all just gone, he said, shaking his head in muted disbelief. Ain't that some shit? Well, at first, there were some suspicions that maybe they'd been set upon by the Comanche, as they were known to be hostile to settlers and were probably the most feared tribe in the area at the time. No, that didn't hold water, especially since so many valuable resources were just left behind in the houses and stores. I'm not talking about gold and weapons and stuff like that either, but food and hides and other supplies that the Comanche raiders would be interested in, especially in the middle of a winter they weren't accustomed to in East Texas. Plus, it was pretty widely known that the Indian tribes native to that area gave it a wide berth for their own reasons. They didn't want anything to do with it, never given the settlers an ounce of trouble before. Hell, I don't think I've ever heard that they even came in contact with them the entire time they were here. Jonas gestured to me for another smoke, which I handed across without a thought. What happened to them? I asked, my brow twisted in a frown. Where'd they all go? He shrugged as he lit the cigarette. Don't know. U.S. Marshals went out there to investigate what the traders had reported. There was no local law around here back then, so it fell to them to see if they could figure out what happened. They found Harper's Hope exactly like the traders had described it, empty and quiet as a tomb. Must have been downright eerie, I'd wager. The only thing that they found giving any hint of what had happened was a diary that had belonged to the young wife of one of the miners. Mrs. Annabelle Hudson, I think was her name. She had written that the men had broken into a new, undiscovered section of natural cave during their digging the day before. Apparently the entire town was all excited at the news, since she wrote that this new chamber was said to be richer than any of the veins they'd found since they first arrived. He said the walls glittered all over with exposed veins of gold. Admittedly, she was worrying at how deep they were mining now, of the risks that come with working that far underground. She was looking forward to the day they could return to New York and live a comfortable life with what they'd pulled from the rocks. Jonas shook his head almost ruefully. Then her next entry took an unsettling turn. She wrote that none of the miners that entered the tunnels that next day ever returned to the surface. The town was worried that there may have been an accident, cave-in or something like that, and a group of townsfolk gathered up and went into those black tunnels in search of their neighbors. He looked at me pointedly and took another drink, letting the silence hang in the air for a beat before adding, None of them came back out either. It's like all that blackness hiding under the hills just swallowed them up, nice as you please. I read her diary once. You can still find the original at one of the Upshur County Historical Museums, though I reckon you can find it easier online these days. Some of her last entries were a fair bit unnerving. You could start to sense the unease she felt as the days passed without any sign of the miner's return. In her last entry, she wrote that one of the other wives had come banging on her door as soon as the sun was above the horizon one morning, scared half to death and ranting on about how she had heard her husband whispering to her through the windows, shuffling around outside their house all night. She'd called out to him, but she said it was like it wasn't really him. Like whatever had made him the man she married had been taken away somehow, just leaving this emotionless thing that beckoned to her. She said she couldn't understand why he didn't just come in, or why his voice sounded so strange when he called to her to come outside. She said it made her think of old, unclean things lurking in the dark. It scared her enough that she'd barricaded herself inside her bedroom with his rifle until just before dawn, when he finally fell quiet and shuffled away into the night. Jonas paused a moment, sitting up straight and working out a kink in his back. He picked up the cup and drained the last bit from it, then refilled it and offered the bottle across to me. I held up a hand and shook my head. He continued, Well, When they went to talk to the other women about the strange occurrence, they discovered 2 of the other wives and their children had gone missing in the night, their doors standing open and houses empty. She'd written that their shoes and coats were still inside, which made it all the stranger, since they'd been experiencing an unusually cold winter and there was still frost on the ground. The old cowboy shrugged and let out a long, weary sigh. That was Annabelle's last entry. After that, the town just died. As no bodies were found to prove that anyone had come to harm, the family still held the deed to the land and the mine. Nobody else could legally come in and work that claim. The town's been empty ever since. At some point, someone set fire to that whole damn place, burned it to the ground. Well, it's probably for the best, all things considered. Jonas leaned back in his chair again. If you grew up around these parts, you grew up with that story. Folks know about Harper's Hope and its history, and most decide to keep clear of it. Most? I asked. Jonas smiled a bit. You're a smart kid, David. Perceptive. I like that about you. Yeah, most. Some folks find the promise of an abandoned gold mine just waiting for somebody to come and take advantage of it to be too much of a temptation. And temptation can drive people to do foolish things. When I was a young man, long before my Laura passed on, I had a couple of friends who had young families of their own. Times were tough back then, even for those who could find steady work. And one day they approached me asking if I had any interest in going in with them to explore the tunnels of that mine, see if there really was any gold left for the taking. If not for the fact that I'd just landed a job on this ranch with good pay and a promise of a future, I might have taken them up on it. As it was, I was too busy trying to prove my worth to the foreman and the other hands. Didn't have time to go on some sort of half-assed treasure hunt. I tried to talk them out of it. Told them it wasn't a good idea to go messing with things that had such a dark history about them, but I knew there wasn't really a chance I'd be able to. Joe and Casey were good men and hard workers. They were just trying to figure out a way to provide for their families during tough times. I don't fault them for that. They were doing what any good man would do to protect their own. Jonas set down his empty cup and grabbed up his canteen, taking a long drink of the cool water. It was 2 weeks later that Claire, that was Casey's wife, came knocking on my door one evening, asking if I'd seen or heard from either of the men. She said they'd gathered up some tools and overnight provisions and headed out a week earlier, but hadn't come back yet. She tried to get hold of Joe's wife, Paula. Hadn't been able to reach her in a couple days. He looked at me, his eyes piercing in the firelight. Claire was born and raised in this area, not 5 miles down the road. Hell, I went to school with her brother, and I've known her family most of my life. She'd heard all the same stories everyone else had about Harper's Hope, and I could see something like fear in her eyes. She had 2 small boys at home, and I think in that moment she was already trying to come to grips with the likelihood she was now a 23-year-old widow. Jonas paused a second, and I could see something like sadness or maybe regret behind his eyes. I could tell she wanted to ask me to go out and try to find them. I think she knew it was unlikely that anyone from around here would risk going into those mines, especially if they had a family of their own to worry about. So she didn't ask, and I didn't offer. We never did see Paula or her kids again. Never any clue as to what happened to them. They just vanished one night without a trace, front door left wide open. The sheriff did a cursory investigation, but I think he knew it was a losing battle. Nobody really believed she'd ever be found, I think. Claire packed up her children and left the very next morning after I spoke with her. She left everything behind that she couldn't load into the bed of Joe's truck and just ran. I could still see that look in her eyes all these years later. She wasn't afraid that she'd never see Joe again. I think she was afraid that she would. Stories from East Texas. The Abandoned Homestead by DarkNightTales. I've never been out here before, I said to Jonas as he brought the old Jeep to a stop. I swung the door open and stepped out, my eyes wandering across the mostly open landscape that stretched out in all directions before settling on the time and weather-worn homestead standing before us.
We'd been driving for a couple of hours along the southern fence line of the Double K Ranch before we reached the edge of the Kirkman's property and proceeded through a galvanized steel gate and into another open area of land beyond, this one wilder and overgrown. Another hour or so of ambling along through the tall grass and rocky ground had brought us to where we now stood. Jonas had told me that we were now in the old McCullen land, a 20,000-acre parcel that Mr. Kirkman had purchased at auction when the last of the McCullen clan died off 15 years prior. From what I had seen, it looked like prime pasture land, and I'd wondered aloud why we didn't graze the cattle out here. After Mr. Kirkman first bought the land, we did just that, Jonas had told me over the whine of the Jeep's engine and the persistent creaking of its suspension as it jounced along the uneven ground. We spent the better part of a month repairing that fence line around this property. Last generation of the McCullen clan had moved away long before, abandoning the ranch and letting this whole place go to seed. Before we were done, we'd just about replaced the whole damned thing. Cost Mr. Kirkman a good sum of money, I'd imagine. Oh yeah? And? I prompted, grunting as the Jeep found a particularly ornery chuck hole and tried to buck me out of my seat. And we lost nearly a dozen head of cattle in that first week, he answered, ashing his cigarette out the open window. I grinned. They got out, huh? Must have missed some breaks in the fence, I suppose. Not surprising. Damn things have a knack for finding the one place they can escape through. Jonas turned a sidelong glance on me and said, I didn't say they got out. Said we lost them. He could sense the questions stirring in my mind and forestalled them with an amused grin from beneath his bushy gray mustache. Story for another time, David. Today we've got some business to see to. We'd best keep our focus. The business that Jonas had mentioned was us looking into a report that came in from one of the crews about an unrecognized truck that they'd seen roaming around on the old McCullen ranch. A parcel I didn't even know was actually part of the Double K Ranch until this very conversation. I'd been working that morning in the garage back at the ranch, doing some much-needed maintenance on some of the four-wheelers that the guys used to move around the property when Jonas walked in. One minute, I was sitting there replacing an oil filter and humming some old song I had stuck in my head, and the next, there he was, standing right there in the open garage bay door. He was silhouetted by the late morning sun, but there was no mistaking that figure. He was tall and lean, but somehow commanding, with the air of strength and authority around him. The old cowboy hat atop his head was as ever-present and predictable as the sunrise. I could barely imagine him without it. Miller's crew called in. Said they saw a truck out in the pastures beyond the eastern fence line, the old McCullen land. Need to go check it out, see what's going on out there, he told me. Grab a rifle, son. I don't expect trouble. I'd rather be ready for it if need be. We'll take the Jeep. I knew that, in days past, Jonas would have taken Tommy with him on something like this. The two had been close friends for longer than I'd been alive. But Tommy had passed away about a month before, after a bout of pneumonia had taken its toll on him. I'd gotten to know both of them fairly well over the last couple years, and Jonas had been including me in more and more of the jobs they were tasked with in recent history. I took it as a special sort of pride that I was being chosen over so many other more seasoned hands, and I was grateful for the chance to get to know Tommy before he passed on. Jonas had never been one to have a large circle of friends, and I got the sense that he'd seen something in me that made him think I'd be a fair addition to it. I appreciated that. I liked the old son of a bitch. So even though I had a full schedule of maintenance that I expected to occupy my time for the rest of the week, I just nodded and stood, wiping the oil from my hands with a rag. Sure thing, Jonas. I'm with you, was all I said. Within 20 minutes, we were loaded up in the Jeep and on our way out to an area of the Kirkman property I'd never visited before. An old, abandoned tract of land spreading out into the distance beyond the border of the barbed wire fence line. And now, here we stood before a surprisingly large and sprawling old homestead, looking more like the beginnings of an aging estate house than what had likely started life as a frontier-era dwelling. 2 stories high and, by all appearances, solid and whole, despite the ravages of the years and the weather that it had seen. It was an unusual sight to come across out here in the middle of all these tree-dotted rolling hills and open fields. The house was surrounded by a long and covered porch that had seen better days, but still looked fairly reliable. A couple of old sitting chairs stood sentry near the front door, their varnish long since stripped by the elements and the wood cracked and dry. I imagined that there had likely once been a dirt road leading up to the house, maybe also a front drive of some sort, but Mother Nature had long since erased that and repainted the area with undisturbed grasslands. She was funny like that. Man can make whatever marks he wants on her domain, but she's patient and watchful. Turn your back or walk away, and there she is, stepping back in to take back what's hers. Behind the house and a bit in the distance off to the left, I saw what looked like the remains of a small patch of farmland, not more than a few acres, cordoned off with lonely fence posts that had long since given up their duty. Even with nature's reclaiming of the fields, I could still see the regular patterns of tilled earth marking the general area of it. Over to the right of the home was an old barn that had clearly not fared as well as the house. Its roof had long since collapsed and the clapboard walls were not much better. The rear corner of the building sagged pretty severely. Between the two was what looked like the crumbling remains of an old cobblestone well, and the remnants of an open bed wagon lay in a heap beyond that, half hidden behind the tall grass. "No shit," I said with a soft whistle, taking it all in. "I didn't even realize this was out here. Would you look at that? It's like something out of a damn movie." Jonas came around the Jeep to stand next to me, popping another smoke from his pack and lighting it. He offered me one and I accepted it with a nod. "I suppose it does at that," he said. "Isaac McCullen built this place about 150 years ago with his family. 6 sons, 2 daughters, a young wife, and a few servants brought along from Ireland. Took them the better part of 5 years to see it finished," Jonas said, then turned his eyes to me and cocked a bushy eyebrow. "Some folks have big ambitions. They're just built that way. Sometimes it goes their way. Most times, I reckon, things don't tend to play out the way they expect, though. Well, I guess old Isaac McCullen probably felt he was laying the foundation of some great legacy. And in fairness, he made a pretty good go of it for a bit. 20 years the McCullens lived here, working the ranch, expanding their family, and making a name for themselves. Ashley McCullen was Isaac's wife, matriarch of the family. It was said she was strikingly beautiful and smarter than the rest of them combined. She'd been the daughter of some minor nobleman back in the old country and must have figured it was her place to rule the entirety of her family here. Jonas leaned back against the Jeep, glancing to the afternoon sun as it began its descent towards the horizon. It was also said she wasn't exactly right in the head, that something inside her was broken, twisted, dark. She was a cruel woman by all accounts. There were whispers that she'd secretly killed and mutilated animals for amusement, though that was a secret that was closely guarded by the rest of the family. As she got into her years, she only got worse, bolder and less inhibited. She barely even bothered to hide the carcasses of the animals she caught anymore. Well, I'm not exactly sure when, but at some point, teenage daughter of one of the servant women went missing. They found the girl's body a couple weeks later, stashed away in some concealed room in the cellar that nobody even knew existed. It was pretty clear that someone had hurt her pretty good before she died. Didn't take long for them to figure out it was Ashley McCullen's hand that did the girl in. She never admitted to it, but I guess there was really no doubt about it. I suppose she felt that she was untouchable, probably wasn't too far wrong in that belief. Out here on the frontier, there wasn't much that could be done against her. There wasn't any law out here back then, even if someone did dare make a public accusation against her. Jonas turned a quick glance to me. The one thing she didn't count on, though, was the girl's mother. I don't recall her name exactly, Dolores or Deirdre or something like that. She was old Celtic blood, kind that doesn't forget the ways of the Druids and their blood magic religions. Story goes that one night, fit of rage, fueled by grief, the dead girl's mother up and sacrificed herself as part of some black ritual, an offering to the ancient pagan gods of her ancestors, in exchange for vengeance against the McCullens. They say a fierce storm rose up out of nowhere that night, all wind and rain and hail, even killed a few of their animals that weren't able to get to shelter in time. No shit, I said, not sure how much of the tale I really believed. I trusted in Jonas's personal accounts, of course, but this was starting to sound like one of those ghost stories people tend to make up to explain things they didn't understand. An old and derelict homestead sitting out in the middle of an abandoned ranch made for a perfect candidate for these types of folk tales. Well, maybe she did and maybe she didn't. Jonas looked at me out of the corner of his eye as he drew a pull on his smoke. Regardless of what any of us believe, though, one fact is undeniable. McCullen started dying after that. At first, it wasn't anything too out of the ordinary, at least for that time. Isaac cut himself by accident one day, took an infection, and died 2 weeks later. The week after, Isaac's eldest son took a spill down the staircase and broke his neck. A month later, one of the daughters climbed up onto the roof in the middle of the night and just stepped off into the air. It went on like that for a while, picking away at the McCullens one by one, getting closer to Ashley day by day. She started losing what was left of her diseased mind, started ranting about the mirrors in the house, about something in the mirrors. She insisted they all be destroyed, all except for one. This one she kept covered all the time, except for when she would peek under the cloth, as if to make sure that whatever she saw in it was still there. Suppose she was afraid that one day she'd look into that mirror and wouldn't find whatever it was that haunted her, that it would finally get close enough to step out of that mirror and come for her. What happened to her? I asked when Jonas paused. He shrugged, finishing his smoke and dropping the butt to the ground where he crushed it out under the heel of his boot. Don't rightly know. Story goes that the few remaining kin decided to pick up and get the hell out of there while they still could, leaving Ashley McCullen all to herself to wander the halls and empty rooms of this place till her final day. The remaining servants, at this point there were only a few left, well, they all just took off in the middle of the night one winter, to points unknown. That's where the stories end. Nobody really knows for sure what happened to Ashley after that. I expect she lived until she died, probably somewhere in this place. I listened as he spoke, letting my gaze wander over the homestead. As my eyes took it all in, I noticed a flash of red nearly hidden on the side of the house. Taking a couple slow steps to my right, I could now make out clearly the Dodge 4x4 parked around the side. "Hey, check it out," I said, calling his attention to it. Jonas's mouth twisted like he'd just tasted something sour, and his brow drew down as he took note of it. "Hell," he spat. "I was really hoping we could just take a quick break here in the shade before moving on." "Who are they?" I asked, starting to feel a little more uncomfortable and exposed out here in the middle of nowhere. My hand found its way to rest lightly on the grip of my holstered pistol, just a reassurance. "Damn fools is who they are. Maybe dead fools, depending on exactly how stupid they are," he said. He glanced at me briefly before looking back at the house. "Ever since those television shows started about people hunting ghosts, seems like all the nut jobs with nothing better to do than to poke around where they don't belong just came out of the woodwork. We get idiots up here every so often walking around with their video cameras and fancy electronic gadgets, thinking they're going to be the next internet sensation. Sometimes we get to them before any damage is done. Sometimes we don't." Jonas reached into the Jeep and pulled 2 compact flashlights from the glove box, handing one to me. I tucked it in my pocket and followed him as he made his way across to the house. I'd seen trespassers before. Most of the time they were just idiot kids trying to find magic mushrooms and cowshit or looking for a place to get drunk or fool around. In those cases, we'd just give them a little scare and run them off, no real harm done. One time, one of the crew had come across a lunatic taking pot shots at the herd with a .22 rifle. That was a bad one. We had to put down 5 head of cattle because the vet couldn't save them after they'd been riddled with bullets. Who the hell does something like that, just for fun? I don't pretend to understand what sort of messed up you have to be to find amusement in that. From what I heard, they gave that particular asshole a hell of a beating before turning him over to the sheriff, and I didn't see that part, so I couldn't swear to it. Honestly, I think he was probably lucky to leave the ranch at all. If it had been another ranch with a different foreman, he'd likely be rotting in a shallow grave somewhere out in the pastures. Hell, one night we even came across a group of folks all stripped down naked and dancing around a campfire under a new moon, bodies all painted in reds and yellows. They were chanting and shouting like they were hopped up on something. I think we must have watched them from a distance for probably 15 minutes before we went and chased them off, just trying to figure out what the hell they were doing. So yeah, I've definitely seen my share of weird out here. We reached the covered porch and mounted the steps, and I took note that the front door stood open a few inches on its iron hinges. The darkness beyond was blacker than I would have expected. It seemed somehow more than just shadow, and I didn't miss the way that Jonas tensed up when he noticed it as well. Something was eating at him, far more than just having to deal with trespassers, that's for sure. He froze when we were in front of the door, and I followed suit, straining to listen for any signs of movement from inside. The only sound that reached our ears, though, was the breeze that swept in from the west and whistled softly through the eaves of the house. I saw Jonas put a hand on the butt of his revolver, though he didn't draw it, push the door inward slowly. The hinges groaned louder than I'd have liked as the door swung open. I didn't figure there was much chance we'd be sneaking up on anyone here. I started to move forward, cross the threshold, when I felt Jonas's hand on my chest, halting me in my tracks. When I looked questioningly at him, I could see the set of his eyes was serious, more serious than I'd ever seen him. When he spoke, he didn't bother keeping his voice low, like he wasn't expecting anyone to hear us regardless. You listen to me, David. I need you to hear what I'm saying. You know all those dark places I told you could be found around these parts if you looked hard enough? I nodded wordlessly, my mouth feeling dry. This place is one of them, he said, his piercing gray eyes boring into mine, leaving no doubt about his earnestness. Death has always surrounded this place, ended up driving what was left of the mccullen clan as far as they could get, trying to escape it. I know you can feel something in the air, something off about this place. So we're going to go inside and take a look around. If we find those fools, we're going to drag them out by their ears and make sure they don't ever come back here again. We're not going to touch anything inside. We're not going to take any souvenirs. We're not going to spend long in there. If we don't find them pretty quick, we're going to head back out and call the sheriff, let them know that we found another abandoned truck out here and they need to come have it towed away. Understand? I nodded, but Jonas shook his head. I need you to say it, David, he said. I cleared my throat and replied, Don't touch anything. Don't take anything. Don't stay inside too long. I understand, Jonas. With Jonas satisfied with my answer, he gave a quick nod of reassurance and stepped across the threshold of the open doorway. I followed. Once inside, I immediately took notice of the drop in temperature. Even though it was a hot and humid July afternoon, the air inside the house must have been at least 15 degrees cooler. Felt like we were stepping into a walk-in refrigerator. We paused inside the doorway for a minute, letting our eyes adjust to the shadowed interior, and I heard Jonas's revolver slowly come free of its leather holster. I pulled my own Sig Sauer just for good measure. There was no immediate threat, but the weight of the 9mm in my hand was reassuring. A moment later, we'd both pulled the flashlights from our pockets and flicked them on, the harsh beams from the LEDs helping to dispel the darkness of the interior. We were standing in a wide entryway, a foyer, I guess you could call it, though they probably had some fancier name for it. The interior was faded and deteriorated with age. The walls looked to have once been a rich burgundy color, but now looked closer to a mottled and sickly red, reminding me of long-dried blood. Twin staircases curved gently up from either side of the room to the second floor, and a wide hallway continued beneath them directly ahead of us. Painted portraits dotted the walls around the room, which I assumed depicted various members of the mccullen family in their heyday. I moved closer to look at one of the larger ones, which depicted a beautiful young woman with falls of flame-red curls and a proud, upturned visage, the light dusting of freckles on her cheeks standing in stark contrast to the air of dominance and superiority she otherwise projected. Her light green eyes were surprisingly vivid and detailed. It was clear that the artist took great pains to accentuate them. "This must be Ashley McCullen," I said, startled by the sudden volume of my own voice in the tomb-silent house. Jonas moved beside me, taking in the details of the portrait. "Yep, that's her. She's young in this painting. Probably done shortly after they settled here. Isaac doted on her, didn't deny her anything." Maybe if he'd taken a stronger hand, things would have turned out different. A clattering of something falling to the floor in a distant part of the house stole our attention away from the portrait abruptly, and I raised my pistol in its direction without thinking. "Come on, then. We'd best get to it," Jonas said gruffly, stepping past me. "Enough dawdling. I don't like being in this place any longer than we need to." I lowered my gun and trailed behind him as we followed the hallway under the staircases, from where we'd heard the sound. As we walked, I tried to be as quiet as the old wooden floor would allow, thankful for the remains of a carpet runner under our feet to help dampen the sound. "Hello?" Jonas called out without warning, making me flinch. Something about this house seemed to insist on silence, as if the sounds of our presence were some sort of affront to whatever was still here. I felt like Jonas was intentionally flying in the face of that, denying any influence the old house was trying to exert over us. "You're trespassing on Kirkman land. We know you're in here. We saw your shitty truck outside. Come out now and there won't be any trouble. You make us find you, it'll go a lot worse for you." Only silence greeted us as the last of his words reverberated through the old structure. Doorways passed us on either side as we made our way deeper into the house, some closed and others standing open, leading into a variety of smaller rooms, each with its own purpose and state of ruin. On our left, we passed what looked like a small sitting room, one wall lined with swollen and crumbling books, now hopelessly lost to the ravages of time. The next room looked like a sewing room, an antique, foot-operated sewing machine resting atop a scarred and dry-rotting desk. A pile of what might have been cloth at one time sat on the floor nearby. The next door was closed, but when we moved past it, a muffled sort of sound rose to our ears from beyond, freezing us in our tracks. It was impossible to make out what it might have been, but it almost sounded organic, like it had been made by a living thing. Jonas looked at the door for a long moment, then turned a questioning eye to me, as if to ask if I had heard it as well. I nodded, taking a couple steps backwards and reaching out to the door handle. It hadn't been fully latched, and when I touched it, it swung inward with a slow moaning of its hinges. A dusty breath of unused air floated past us, smelling of age and forgotten things. We both gathered at the doorway, looking upon the wooden steps descending into darkness. I guessed it was the basement and glanced up to Jonas. He met my eyes for a heartbeat, then turned back to the inky black descent. "Hello down there. Come on up where we can see you. We don't want to hurt you. We just need you to leave this place. You're trespassing, and I'm giving you the chance to leave on your own accord. We're not in the mood for any games, so let's just handle this like grown-ups." This time, his voice seemed to be swallowed up by the shadows below, almost like he was talking into a thick fog. We waited a tick longer, then Jonas pointed down at the uppermost steps with the beam of his light. I could clearly make out at least 2 different sets of shoe prints in the thick dust that coated the wood. There was another set, mostly obscured and unrecognizable, but they almost looked like they were made by bare feet. Another shared glance, and we wordlessly started down the narrow staircase to the cellar below. The air here was even cooler than above, and unlike the humidity of the day, the dampness I felt here seemed almost slick on my skin. The air was thick and musty, claustrophobic and foul. I tried to breathe through my nose as we went and wondered what the hell could cause such a fetid atmosphere. Jonas was the first to spot the stray beam of a flashlight streaming across the basement from where it lay on the floor, casting a bright white beam against one mildewed wall. It rocked almost imperceptibly, like it had been dropped and was just now coming to a rest. "Something's not right about this," I said in a low voice. "That's a hell of an understatement," Jonas grunted quietly and took a step into the room. I followed on his heels, keeping my eyes and ears sharp for anything out of place. As I swung my flashlight around the surprisingly large room, it picked out the scattered leavings of years of storage. Old and broken furniture stood stacked haphazardly around the room, along with wooden crates both whole and split open, spilling whatever miscellaneous contents they once held. The room was like a maze with all the clutter, and we walked slowly, carefully through it, the beams of our lights illuminating tiny sparkling motes of dust that floated in the still air. Ahead, I could see another light source, looking a lot like the dropped flashlight we'd already passed. We navigated around a larger stack of crates, and I sucked in a breath of surprise when a bright light flashed in my eyes. "Son of a bitch!" I cursed, reflexively flinching and bringing my pistol up. It only took me a heartbeat before I realized that it was my own light, reflected back at me by a tall and ornate mirror hung on the far wall. I had to bark a quick laugh at my own skittishness. Jonas wasn't amused, though. In the ambient light spilling from my flashlight, I could see his face was twisted into a sharp frown, brows drawn together. "Goddamn idiots," he swore in a quiet voice, and I heard the distinctive clicking of his revolver's hammer being drawn back. I wasn't sure what had him so riled, but hearing the steel in his tone set me on edge, and the sheepish grin melted from my face. We emerged from the stacks into a sort of an open area at the far wall of the dusty and long-forgotten cellar, and I now saw a black drop cloth spilled on the floor below the gilded mirror. The mirror was strange, though I couldn't quite put my finger on exactly what it was about it. Sure, it was pretty ornate, but from what Jonas had said about Ashley McCullen, it didn't surprise me that she'd have something so fancy. No, it was something about the glass, I thought, moving closer with slow steps, eyes fixed on the thing. What was it about it? "David," Jonas said, but I was lost in my thoughts. The image in the mirror, that's what it was, I realized. The whole thing seemed just a little distorted, almost like one of those carnival funhouse mirrors, but not quite as exaggerated. The effect was subtle, like I was looking at it through a thin skin of oil, and it made everything in it look surreal and wrong. "David," Jonas said again, this time a hint of warning in his voice. "Just a second," I said distantly, feeling like I almost had it figured out. Just another minute, I thought. I reached out my hand to touch the mirror, thinking that maybe feeling the surface of the glass might help me understand why it looked so strange. It was then that Jonas grabbed my shoulder roughly and spun me around to face him, the harsh brightness of our flashlights casting angry shadows across his face. "Don't," he ordered, locking eyes with me. "It's Ashley McCullen's mirror." He stooped down and snatched up the drop cloth, replacing it over the corners of the ornate frame, carefully keeping his eyes averted the entire time. The mirror now covered once again, he gave me a quick shove back towards the stairs. "We're getting out of here now." "But what about the trespassers?" I asked in confusion. What was going on? His face was granite, all hard edges and without a hint of emotion. "They're gone. We'll call the sheriff and have their truck towed, but we're quitting this place now." I didn't understand. "Gone? But their truck's still outside. Where'd they go?" And then my eyes drifted past Jonas and caught what he already knew would be there somewhere. A man lay sprawled on his back on the floor not too far from the mirror. A fancy video camera and a few other gadgets were scattered around him on the floor, as if he'd dropped whatever he was carrying when he fell. He was dressed in jeans and sneakers and was wearing a t-shirt that had some sort of cartoon character on it that I didn't recognize. But all that fell away when my eyes drifted further to look at his face. Or at least, where his face should have been. Even now, I have a hard time putting in words what I saw in that moment. It was like someone had taken a huge, impossibly sharp spoon and just scooped the front of his head away, neat as can be. What remained was smoothly cut, not torn or mangled or anything like that. And it wasn't just his skin that was missing either, but his skull had been neatly sliced away too. What I was looking at now was only what remained of the back half of his head. I could see the glistening wetness of what was left of his brain, pink and white and gray and so cleanly cut that it almost looked like it was pressed under a pane of glass. Below that, I saw what remained of his nasal cavities and jaw, a few molars and wisdom teeth still in their homes like nothing was amiss. I stood there in shock for a minute, my mind fixating on the fact that there wasn't any blood anywhere. A wound like this, something this terrible, the place should have been covered in it. But there was none. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing, and it wasn't until I heard Jonas again that I was drawn out of it and back into the present. "Watch out, boy," he shouted in the dark cellar, and I felt myself being jerked backwards by my collar, pulled off balance and nearly toppling over a stack of old and discolored wooden crates. I didn't get a good look at what had caused his alarm, but I saw his stainless steel .44 Magnum swing up in the dim light, aiming at something in the shadows. The next moment, my ears were ringing and the darkness was shattered by the muzzle flash and incredible thundering of his gun in the confined space. It was so loud and violent, I could actually feel the concussion in my chest with each pull of the trigger. 6 chambers, 6 cartridges, 6 trigger pulls. The strobe of each shot lit his face in a stark yellow light, and when his gun ran dry, he reached out and grabbed me, pushing me hard towards the staircase. He shouted something at me, but I couldn't make anything out over the painful ringing in my ears, so I just took his lead and ran as best I could through the cluttered space until I reached the base of the steps. There I stopped and turned, bringing my pistol up as Jonas moved past me and started up the narrow staircase, shouting for me to follow him. I could barely make out his words, but their intent was clear enough. I was about to haul ass up the steps after him when I saw something emerging from the darkness, gliding between the stacks of crates and discarded furniture. I raised my flashlight and nearly screamed like a schoolgirl at what I saw. Despite the years and devastation that death should have brought to her, I recognized the resemblance of the thing that shambled towards me. I'd seen its likeness in the entryway upstairs, in the portrait we'd examined. Holy shit, it was Ashley McCullen. Impossibly alive, but not really, not in any fair sense of the word. Her skin was gray and stretched tight across her skull, which was bald except for a few patchy spots of dirty red hair plastered wetly to her head. Her teeth were broken and jagged, all yellow and brown, and protruding from blackened gums from behind receded lips that could no longer come together to cover them. Her eyes were the only things untouched by the ages, it seemed. Those bright green eyes filled with hate and hunger. There was evil in them, there was no doubt about that. All humanity was gone from those eyes. It was like looking into a doll's eyes, created by some mad toy maker. Jesus Christ! Was all I could say, stumbling backwards against the bottom step as the thing that had been Ashley McCullen fixed its gaze on me with those demon eyes and surged forward towards me in a rush. I didn't even realize I'd taken aim with my own gun and started emptying the magazine at the thing until I'd felt the painful shocks to my ears once again. I watched as bullets punched holes in the faded and decaying dress the thing still wore, staggering it with a little tremor at each impact. One of the rounds caught her in the cheek and peeled part of it right off, sending bone and dried flesh flying into the abyss. Still she came, and a moment later my finger found itself resting on a dead trigger, the magazine spent and slide locked back on an empty chamber. Jonas shouted something at me from the top of the staircase, and I turned and ran as hard as my legs would carry me, taking the steps 2 at a time. I burst through the doorway at the top and crashed heavily into the opposite wall, my shoulders screaming in pain at the impact. Sparing a quick look back down the darkened cellar staircase, I could see that damned thing climbing the steps, now dropped to all fours and scrambling upwards like some nightmare insect. Jonas grabbed my shirt to get me started, and we hauled ass down the hallway, through the foyer and finally out through the front door into the sunlight beyond. We must have both forgotten about the few steps leading down from the porch, because a moment later we were both airborne and tumbling painfully to the ground. In an instant, I was on my back, my now empty pistol aimed almost comically at the vacant doorway of the house, waiting for that abomination to appear and launch itself at us both. It never came, and after a few long, heart-pounding moments, Jonas climbed painfully to his feet, retrieving his revolver from the grass nearby and reholstering it. He moved to stand over me and offered me his hand, pulling me to my feet. He glanced back over his shoulder at the house, at the empty doorway. I could almost swear I saw those 2 green eyes peering out from the shadows of that place. At us. "We're safe now," he said, pulling 2 cigarettes from his pack and handing one over to me. I didn't miss the tremble in his normally steady hand as he held the lighter out for me. "She won't come past the threshold." He walked over and leaned heavily against the front bumper of the Jeep, resting his hands on his knees as his breathing began to slow to a more normal pace. Reluctantly, I released the slide on my pistol and reholstered it on my belt, walking over beside him and concentrating on my own racing heartbeat and ragged breathing. We remained there for several minutes in silence, crashing down from the adrenaline rush and feeling drained and weary. The sun was growing low in the sky, and I wasn't so sure I wanted to be here when it dipped below the horizon. Jonas must have had the same thought, because he finally stood and walked around to the driver's side of the Jeep, pausing for a beat before he got in. "Congratulations, David. Now you got a story of your own," he said, and I didn't miss the hint of a wry grin beneath his bushy gray mustache. I spared one last wary look at that old homestead and climbed into the Jeep as he started the engine. "I think I'd rather just listen to yours, Jonas, all things considered." The low, rolling rumble of thunder swept across the open plains like an ocean wave and passed over the layover bunkhouse with a growing crescendo that rattled the rafters and windows with its passage. I paused a moment and glanced out through the open doorway leading to the covered front porch and the dim light of the waning day beyond. After another few beats, I resumed pouring a cup of coffee and replaced the decanter to the hot plate before wandering out to join Jonas. The old cowboy was resting his elbows on the timber railing that fronted the aging porch, the tin cup and a neglected cigarette dangling from his hands. His eyes were focused out across the landscape, though the last bits of afternoon daylight were rapidly fleeing in the face of the coming thunderheads. I had the feeling he wasn't really looking at anything in particular, and probably was just relaxing and letting his thoughts wander after a long day surveying the far side of the old McCullen land. I could already feel the drop in temperature, and the air felt heavy and pregnant with the promise of coming rain. He spared a sideways glance at me as I joined him, and I didn't miss the half grin he offered. He took a drag from his smoke and gestured out to the shadowed landscape. "I'll tell you, David, even after all these years, there's just something special about being out here all alone. Makes a man feel new, if you take my meaning." Thought I did, and nodded as I sipped at the steaming mug. Coffee was strong and bitter, but I didn't mind so much. In the distance, lightning strobed and danced in the heavy cloud line that was rapidly marching our way. The wind was starting to pick up a bit, blowing in chaotic gusts that couldn't seem to figure out which direction they should be headed, tugging at us from all different directions. "Bad night to be out there," Jonas said, flicking his spent smoke out into the dim light in a brief flare of sparks. I ducked my head and took a seat in one of the old wooden chairs we dragged out to the porch earlier. "I'm glad we're going to be under a roof tonight, that's for sure. No offense, but I wasn't looking forward to sharing that tiny excuse for a tent with you, old man," I said with a chuckle. Jonas cracked a grin and took the other chair, both of us sinking back and relaxing after a long day in the Jeep. "Yeah, well, can't say as I blame you, I guess. I'm just glad the rain held off long enough for us to make it to this old place," he said, stamping his boot on the weather-worn wood of the porch. "It's been a bit since I've been out to this section. Almost forgot this bunkhouse was even out here." We'd been out riding the perimeter of the McCullen land in the Jeep since before sunrise that morning, surveying the damage caused by the violent storms that had swept through over the last week. Several tornadoes had touched down all over East Texas, causing all sorts of trouble, and Mr. Kirkman's land hadn't been spared. Earlier that day, we'd passed a quarter-mile section of fence line that was just gone, replaced with an angry brown track of destruction, nearly as wide as that scarred across the land, marking the passage of a pretty fair twister. Jonas had guided the Jeep carefully over the upturned earth while I took pictures and made notes of the location and damage. Crews would be out in the coming weeks to begin repairs, but that was for later. As the day wore on, the bright blue skies had begun to show evidence of turning nasty, but we'd been told that the worst of the weather had passed, so it wasn't very likely we were in for more than just the normal summer gutter washers. Sure, there'd be plenty of thunder, lightning, and wind, but we didn't expect it to escalate much beyond that, or at least that was our hope. As evening began to approach, Jonas had turned the Jeep away from the fence and towards a small structure I spied in the distance. He told me it was left over from the McCullen days and should serve us pretty well as a shelter overnight. At first, my stomach sank when he mentioned it. but he caught the look in my eyes and quickly followed it up with reassurances that there was nothing ominous or ugly about the place. It was just an old ranch hand bunkhouse that had been used over the years as a layover for men working out in this area. I wasn't completely at ease, my thoughts drifting back to that damned abandoned homestead, but I knew it was going to be a hell of a sight more comfortable than the two of us trying to sleep in the Jeep or share the small tent that was stuffed in the back seat. When we reached the rough timber building, I was relieved to see that it wasn't much more than a single-room structure with a few chairs and cots scattered around the interior, which was surprisingly well kept. I suppose it was likely due to the fact that the place was still used by some of Mr. Kirkman's crews from time to time. So we parked the Jeep out front and brought our supplies inside for the night. Jonas and I sat for a while in silence, just watching the approaching thunderheads and listening to the wind as it raced across the open fields of tall grass. It was cool and damp and smelled of rain. Overall, a nice change from the heat we'd experienced earlier in the day. Jonas had drained his cup and refilled it from the bottle, offering me a splash of whiskey for my coffee, which I accepted gratefully, trading him for another cigarette. As he was reclaiming his chair with a quiet grunt, he said, "Never did like the storms out here, though." It was a pretty innocuous statement, but something in the way he said it made me think he had more to say, and I turned my attention over to him with a raised eyebrow. He stroked his steel-gray mustache for a moment, his cool eyes wandering over the vista before returning to meet mine. "The Caddo Indians have legends about the storms around here," he started, then paused and chuckled a bit. "Hell, I guess they have legends for just about everything now that I think about it. But the storms were something they seemed especially wary of. I used to work with a man, full-blood Caddo, Levi Whiteash. He was raised among the Caddo tribes and grew up listening to all the stories from his people. He used to like to spook the greenhorns whenever he had a chance by breaking out some bit of dark legend while everyone was around the fire. He was a fair, imposing man if you didn't know him close. Big bear of a man that stood a head taller than most everyone else and hard as a rock." Jonas smiled at the memory, his eyes going distant for a moment. He had his gold tooth right up front, where he'd gotten one knocked out during a tussle at a bar once. Gave him a bit of a menacing look, I'll admit. Once you got to know him, you realized he was just about the gentlest and most easy-handed man you're like to run across. His eyes met mine again before roaming back out across the plains. Hell, on weekends he used to go volunteer up some homeless shelter up near Gilmer. At Christmas, he'd dress up as old St. Nick and pass out gifts to the kids of the other ranch hands. He never married or had kids of his own, so he made up for it by trying to take care of everyone else like they were his. Jonas paused a moment, then bobbed his head almost to himself. He was a good man, good friend. A smile crept across his face, barely hidden by the bushy mustache. Of course, he did have a mischievous streak about him and took every opportunity to play up the whole mysterious red man routine. Tickled him, I guess. Wasn't anything mean-spirited about it, and everyone always ended up laughing in the end. Hell, I'd be willing to bet that half the stories he told were made up on the spot, just as he was spitting them out. Some of them, though. Some of them were real. "Real?" I asked, cocking an eyebrow and lighting a cigarette. "You mean real stories from his people?" "I mean real," Jonas said, locking eyes with me. "You know what I'm saying, David. You've seen with your own eyes things out here that shouldn't be. Things that have climbed right off the pages of some two-bit horror novel. I've said it before, but there are things around these parts that don't belong in the light of day. Things you're not like to run across in other places." After a bit of silence, I closed my mouth and nodded, the memories of the mccullen homestead still raw in my mind. A peal of thunder shook the air and lightning lit the sky above us. I jumped a bit, despite myself, and looked back out across the fields. I could hear the distant soft hiss of rain on the tall grass and thought it wouldn't be much longer before it was upon us. Jonas sat back in his chair and continued. "Nights like this, when the storm swept in and covered everything in darkness and noise, He used to talk about the shadows that came in the night. The others. The ones who answered the call of the storm. It didn't happen with every storm, of course. Sometimes, when you were far away from the lights of civilization and safety, you would hear a call, long and low and otherworldly, just below the hiss of the rain and the howling of the wind, like a horn from hell. He shrugged and shook his head, taking a sip from his cup. Hell, for all I know, that's exactly what it was. I ran with Levi for a while, just like you and me now. Sometimes, when he got into his drink, he'd tell me stories that he didn't share with the greenhorns. All those tales that he told them around campfires were just to entertain, maybe put a bit of scare in them. But those tales were safe, just a bit of fiction to pass the time. Jonas gestured out into the dim light with his tin cup. Somewhere out there is a watering hole, out past the fence line and up into the hills a bit. Seen it myself once. I could tell you it set me on edge just looking at that black, still water. It's surrounded all around by stones, like some sort of barrier constructed by long-forgotten hands. Levi told me that his people would sooner die of thirst than to so much as approach those waters. He said it had no bottom, just fell off into the murky darkness forever. He flashed a wry smile at me. That ain't likely possible, I suppose. Just deep. I nodded, briefly turning my attention to a particularly brilliant flash of lightning that left its glowing after-image on the inside of my eyelids when I blinked. The thick, bruised clouds were growing closer with each passing minute at a surprising pace. I was sure we'd be under them before too long. Levi told me that during storms like this one, when that call rolled out across the dark plains, the shadows would drag themselves from that watery pit and roam across the lands of men. Jonas took a sip of his Irish coffee and fixed me with one of those looks. Woe be the soul caught out in the open when they came. I stayed quiet, letting the old man talk. My eyes drifted back to the wide-open grassy lands that stretched out in front of us for what seemed like forever. I watched as the foothills in the distance grew shadowed and vague, then completely consumed by the thunderheads. Felt like the land was being eaten up as they approached. Like maybe if a man were to take a mind of it and drive out there, beyond the leading edge of the storm, maybe he'd find nothing but infinite blackness where the hills once stood. Jonas fell quiet, his eyes gaining that faraway look he got when he found himself wandering through old memories. I lit another smoke and sat for a moment in silence, feeling the heavy, damp air blow across the covered porch of the bunkhouse, bringing with it the earthy smells of upturned ground. The temperature was starting to drop a bit with the coming of the storm, but I didn't mind so much. I don't think I ever met Levi, I said after a minute, taking a drag from my cigarette and following it with a sip of the now cooling coffee. He shook his head, dragged back from his reverie. No, you wouldn't have. Levi's been gone a long while now. Jonas didn't offer anything more about his friend, and I didn't press. You ever heard it? I asked instead. The call? Maybe. Hell, I don't really know, to tell you the truth. You hear a lot of strange things out here when you're alone and the storms blow in. Can't rightly say that any of them were the call, exactly. He looked at me over his cup. Then again, I sure as hell never went to investigate them either. I've seen enough to know that a man shouldn't go sticking his nose where it don't belong, especially out here. I ducked my head in agreement, taking a last drag off my cigarette before flicking the butt out into the rapidly dwindling twilight. I could see the rain now, drifting in beneath the churning storm clouds like a hazy curtain. The air was filled with the smell of it and felt charged with the lightning that flashed and boomed from within that bruised mass. I was about to stand and refill my coffee when Jonas started talking again, his gaze disconnected, distant. It was a night like this one, he said, pouring another splash of whiskey into his tin cup. A lot like this one, as a matter of fact. It was just the three of us, me and Tommy and Levi, sitting right up here on this porch and watching a storm roll in over us. Back then, we didn't use Jeeps to get around the ranch.
They were too expensive, and Mr. Kirkman figured that if we already had horses, there was no reason to buy a bunch of fancy jeeps that he'd need to spend even more money on to maintain. He gestured with his cup, a motion that took in the vast area of open land in front of us. The three of us had been out riding the fences for a couple of days already when the weather took a turn that afternoon. Tommy remembered that this bunkhouse was out here. I'd forgotten about it completely. And so we rode at a pretty good pace from that fence line directly for here, hoping to beat the storm. Nobody wants to get caught out in one of these summer storms. Hell, even if you don't mind being soaked to the bone, it ain't a good idea to be the tallest thing in the area when the lightning starts looking for a way to ground. Jonas cocked an eyebrow and turned a sideways look on me. Saw a bull get struck by lightning once. Damnedest thing. Storm rolled in and the rest of the herd moved on into some trees for shelter, but this ornery thing just stood there in the middle of the pasture, like it was daring nature to mess with it. Wasn't but a couple of minutes before the bolt of lightning came down and lit the whole area in its blinding white light. Hit the bull right between the horns, burned through its body and down to its legs. Went rigid all of a sudden, like all its muscles locked up at once. I remember it took a single step after that. Just one step. Then it went still and didn't move again. He smirked, somewhere between amusement and wonder. Son of a bitch was deader than shit, still standing there, like it refused to give up. It was burned hollow from the top of its skull down to its hooves. Never fell over. Never seen anything like it. Jonas took another drink and shook his head, pulling himself back from his wanderings. He adjusted the age-worn cowboy hat on his head a bit and continued. Anyway, we didn't exactly make it here ahead of the rain, but the worst of it hadn't caught us out in the open either. We tied the horses in the shed out back and worked on getting ourselves into a dry change of clothes. Then we came out and settled with a warm drink to watch the rain. We were sitting right here, as a matter of fact. Tommy was over on my left, and Levi was sitting right where you are now. I shifted a little in the wooden chair at that, feeling a little uncomfortable, like I was somehow trespassing on a dead man's spot or something. I knew it was silly, but that awareness didn't change anything. Just then, the heavy cloud front finally reached us, stripping away the last of the dying daylight and casting us into deep shadow. The staccato sounds of fat raindrops began striking the tin roof of the bunkhouse, ringing dull and hollow. Then a blinding flash of lightning lit the area in a ghostly pale light, and an incredibly ear-splitting and violent crack of thunder shattered the air at the same instant, so loud and sharp that I felt a concussion in my bones, felt it shake the boards beneath my feet. I jumped a fair bit at that, spitting out a curse with my heart pounding in my chest. Jonas hadn't so much as flinched, turning his eyes back to the grassy expanse before us. We were just sitting here, shooting shit and working our way through a bottle when Levi stopped talking all of a sudden, mid-sentence. His brow knotted up and he tilted his head a little, turning his attention out into the rain. He'd heard something, though what it was I didn't know. Neither me or Tommy had heard anything out of the ordinary. "Did you hear that?" he'd asked us, coming to his feet and standing at the edge of the porch. At first I thought he was just messing with us, trying to throw a scare into us like he often did with the greenhorns. But if you'd seen his eyes and the way the blood drained from his face, it was clear he was dead serious. Jonas drained the rest of his cup, which had long since gone from Irish coffee to just straight whiskey, set it on the floorboards beside his chair. "What did you hear?" I asked, my heartbeat slowly returning to normal. Jonas shook his head. He said it sounded like someone calling out to us from somewhere out in the storm. I told him he was hearing things, but there wasn't anyone around us for miles in any direction. Nobody'd be fool enough to wander around in the dark when a storm like this was upon us. But he wouldn't let it go. He swore that there was someone out there, just beyond where we could see, moving around the bunkhouse. Me and Tommy both listened as hard as we could. The only thing either of us could hear was the hissing of the rain across the fields and the whistling of the wind. Tommy made some joke about how Levi couldn't handle his fire water, and we tried to laugh it off. But you could see that Levi was really rattled.
Jonas looked back at me, his eyes cast in dark shadows. I ain't gonna lie, David. Seeing this big old hoss, one of the toughest sons of bitches I'd ever known, shook up like that, well, it was more than enough to steal away any other jokes we might have had. I finished my own mug and set it atop the porch railing, lighting another smoke with my Zippo. What happened? The old cowboy shrugged and leaned back a bit in his chair. Levi eventually settled down, but we all felt this weight hanging over us. Decided to just call it a night. None of us felt like drinking or laughing anymore, and I think we were just hoping to forget about it until the light of day. It was probably close to 2 a.m. when the sound of something moving quietly inside the bunkhouse woke me up. I snapped awake and had my gun halfway out of my holster when I recognized it was just Levi in the dim light from the lantern, pulling on his boots. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" I'd asked him. He looked at me with the most haunted eyes I'd ever seen in my life. "It's back," was all he said. Before I could say a word, Levi rose up and pulled the door open, stepping out into the night. It was still coming down pretty hard at that point, and the wind blew in through the open doorway, bringing the rain with it. I jumped up and ducked after him, giving Tommy a kick on the way out to rouse him. By the time I stepped out onto the porch, Levi had already stalked off into the rain, hell-bent for leather. I saw his silhouette for a moment, the unmistakable shape of his big old magnum held in one hand. Then he was gone, disappeared into the night. Jonas went to dig another smoke from his pack, but found it empty. I absently held my pack out to him, which he accepted with a nod of thanks. I went as far as the edge of the porch, shouting out to him as loud as I could. I didn't see so much as a hint of him out there. I thought I heard a few words that sounded like he might have been calling out to someone, but I can't be sure about that. When I heard the scream and the gunshots, I yanked my pistol from its holster and took a step towards the edge of the porch, ready to run off into the storm after my friend. I would have, too, if not for the fact that Tommy had come up behind me and grabbed my arm, holding me in place. I tried to shrug him off, intent on charging out after Levi, but Tommy had an iron grip when he was a younger man. He about yanked me off my feet when I tried to rush out again. Couldn't understand why he was holding me back, and I cursed at him to let me go. Instead, he just snatched me back again, harder this time. "No, Jonas," he hissed, his voice as urgent and commanding as I'd ever known it to be. "Look," he told me, pointing an unsteady finger out into the stormy night. Jonas lit the cigarette that he'd been holding, and I could see a bit of shake to the ember as he drew a deep breath before exhaling the gray-blue smoke. He picked up the bottle of whiskey and took a swig from it, not bothering with the cup. I don't think I'd ever seen him this agitated before. His unease was infectious. It was full dark now, and the storm hadn't lost any of its intensity with the failing of the light. My mind was trying to play tricks on me. Shadows flitted in and out of existence at the edges of visibility, and the white noise of the rain sweeping across the tall grass created ghostly voices in my ears. I touched lightly at the pistol on my hip, as if to reassure myself that it was still there. I felt foolish as soon as I did it. That didn't stop me from unsnapping the strap, securing it in the holster. "I seen one, David," Jonas said after another pull from the bottle, fixing me with those piercing eyes. "Tommy hadn't stopped me. I'd have run right out after Levi. That damn thing was waiting for me. It knew I was going to rush out after him, and it was just waiting for me." "What was?" I asked, barely above a raspy whisper. Jonas handed me the bottle, and I took a swallow. "What did you see?" Jonas paused, trying to find the words. "It was tall, 9 feet if it was an inch. Thin. Gaunt is a better word. Almost sickly. Seemed like it wasn't much more than skin and bones. Had this great misshapen head that was too big for its hunched body. And its hands. Its hands were malformed and skinny as the rest of it, with fingers as long as my forearm, all twisted and distorted. It was like someone had taken all the wrong parts and tried to make a living thing out of them. But it moved, David. Jesus help me, but it moved like lightning, like a coiled snake. You'd swear a thing that tall and skeletal wouldn't be able to move like that, but when it saw Tommy holding me fast, keeping me from dashing off into the storm, it made this god-awful hissing moan, like the last breath from a dying man, like it was furious that I'd been snatched back from its grip, like it was hungry. Without a thought, I swung my hand cannon up and emptied it at the thing until the hammer just clicked on spent cases. It just stood there, watching me with empty eye sockets, not even registering my gunshots. Then it was gone into the darkness, just a flicker of motion that was too fast to track. "Holy shit, Jonas," was all I could say at first. "I don't understand. Why didn't it come for you? It was right there. Why didn't it attack?" Jonas shook his head and shrugged. "I'm not sure exactly. I had the impression that it wanted to, but couldn't. Like it wasn't made to stand in the world of men. Maybe it couldn't come up onto the porch or into the bunkhouse. Maybe it needed me to come to it, the way Levi had. As you'd imagine, me and Tommy didn't get any sleep after that. He'd herded me back inside and shut the door, moving a chair in front of it and sitting there, like he was worried I'd try to go out after Levi again. He smirked a little bit at this, though there wasn't any real amusement in his eyes. There wasn't any chance of that, I can tell you. You know me, David. You know I'm not one to back down from just about anything, even out here. But it would have taken old Lucifer himself on my ass to chase me out into the storm that night, out into the darkness." I nodded slowly at him, considering his words carefully. "Did you ever find Levi?" I asked reluctantly. Jonas turned his attention back out into the heavy rain and fell silent for a bit. I could see his mind was working, sifting through old memories. I hated to prod him on it, but I needed to know the rest. "Next morning, as soon as the sun was up and the storm had blown itself out, me and Tommy threw our things on the horses and set out to look for him. It wasn't hard to follow where he'd gone. Where he'd been taken, I mean. The tall grass had been flattened in a straight line, like something heavy had been dragged through it in the night. We followed it all morning, moving towards the foothills. When we reached the fence line, found a bit of bloody cloth hung up on one of the barbs. It looked like a piece from his shirt, caught up and torn as he was dragged through the fence. The horses couldn't cross there, so we tied them off and went on by foot, back into the trees and up into the hills. It was tough going. The ground was muddy and soft from the rains, and that just meant we were able to follow the trail without too much trouble." Jonas turned an eye to me. "Strange. Other than the path made by something being dragged along, there were no prints. Anyway, about an hour after we started into the trees, we came across a pool of black water, maybe 20 feet across, smooth as glass and with a kind of oily sheen to it. I have no idea how deep it was, but we couldn't see the bottom. Couldn't see if it even had a bottom. It was bordered all around by field stones. There wasn't a real clearing or anything like that. It just sat there in the middle of the woods on a bit of level ground. The trees grew right up to the edge of it, though the ones closest to that black water were twisted and diseased looking, all gray and withering. Another pause as Jonas took a drag from his cigarette and washed it down with a swallow of whiskey. Tommy spotted the bones first. He always had sharper eyes than me, never missed a thing. On the far side of that black pool stretched out what remained of a man, stripped down to bleached bones, he continued, and shook his head in puzzlement, like he was still trying to figure it out. It was just the upper half of a skeleton. I guess the rest was somewhere at the bottom of that inky hole. It looked like it was trying to claw its way out from the water, arms all outstretched and reaching. "Bones," I replied, not understanding. Jonas looked at me a moment, corner of his mouth pulled up in a wry grin, almost a grimace really, that faded as quick as it'd come. Tommy may have spotted the bones first, but I spied that familiar gold tooth still stuck in that bleach-white skull right off. He fell silent again, and I felt like the story had run its course. After a few more minutes of nothing but the falling rain and rolling thunder, Jonas stood from his chair and moved to the doorway, handing me the half-empty bottle as he passed. I think I'm off to bed. Been a long day and I'm weary. Think I've talked enough, he said. He paused and fixed me with a firm eye. Don't you go wandering, David. Not tonight. Keep these floorboards under your feet, you hear? I responded with a quick nod, a combination of assent and a good night to my friend. Good man. Jonas returned the nod and gave me a quick pat on the shoulder as he passed. He'd just stepped a foot through the open doorway when he stopped, his head tilting to the side and brow drawn low. His narrowed eyes found mine, and I saw that same haunted look as before. Did you hear that?